Hi there, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee of Colleagues. I'm your host, Greg Butz. Today we're going to be joined by Anthony Williams Rivera. Anthony is a fellow MBA student at University of New Mexico and tutor of children. And we're also going to be joined by Danielle Price-Riddle, mother of one of my former students. This is a Coffee with Colleagues first. So we're so thankful and grateful that you're here to join us on a topic of equity, civil rights, and education. This is a doozy. It'll go away. You know, this is going to be a sensitive topic and all, but we can handle it. We absolutely can handle it. So we're going to get the show started here momentarily. We're so thankful and grateful that you're here. Come on in. Welcome. And we're recording. Welcome to the show. Today we're joined by Anthony Williams Rivera, who is also a fellow MBA. He's not in my cohort, but he's getting his MBA from the University of New Mexico. And we're joined by a dear friend of mine, Danielle Price. She is the parent of one of my former students. And so it's a special privilege and honor for both of you to join the show. And today, let's start off with the easiest question. What is your caffeinated beverage of choice?
Okay.
Coffee.
Well, for me, it is coffee. Yep, same.
Any
Coffee.
special way that you prefer it?
Lots of cream.
I'll make it in stovetop.
Okay.
Stovetop? Oh, so you make it on the stove itself? Is that what you're saying? Oh.
Very strong taste.
I like it with some cinnamon too, like to add real cinnamon to it.
Yes.
And I love caramel. Anything with caramel, I'm there. I got it. And at nighttime, I love a good chai tea. I love going around trying different teas at different places. So
that's awesome. You know, when I lived in Egypt, they would actually make the espresso right on the stovetop. So when you said that, it just like brought me back to when I lived there for 6 years. I never made coffee on the stovetop, but I do remember that is how all of my friends consumed it. I actually tried to not be on coffee while I was there, and I failed miserably at times. Into coffee, it seems to, but it's one of those mediums that kind of brings us together. And so as we dive into this topic, it is a heavy topic, but it's one that needs to be asked. And we're talking about equity, equality, and we're talking about how the different various movements affect education, and in addition to that, what is education's role in kind of solving or leading the way of discussions. And so I wanted to start off by the requests I asked of both of you. I find that sometimes it's difficult to get the right answers if we don't ask the right questions. And so I'm just wondering, why is it that we're struggling in some of that and the questions that we're asking? If either of you could speak to that.
I think the hardest part about knowing what questions to ask is comfort level. I think people are wanting to make sure that they're not being offensive, but also wanting to ask questions and not knowing how to ask them without offending someone, or not knowing where to go to get good information. So I think for the people in my life, that's been their hardest question is, I don't know what to say to you, so what do you need, or how can I help? And sometimes just asking what you know is the best way to do it. There's no right or wrong. Sometimes just asking I think that's the first step. So,
in my own experience, what I've seen with a lot of people, especially around my own age, is of course, what to ask. Some people don't know what to ask and they're uncomfortable with not knowing. And the other part is some people don't want to be asked, which is interesting. Because I guess if you're going to speak about a serious topic, there's a time and a place to do it. And it's not just like you go out and you're hanging out with your friends and then suddenly someone wants to have a deep conversation with you. It may be, seen as like, why are you asking me this now? instead where you can ask somebody maybe one-on-one, or ask them, hey, can I meet with you on the side? I have some questions for you that I'd like to get answered. And you can get a positive response or a negative response. It just depends on who you speak to.
That's powerful. One of the things that I think about in terms of my own role as an educator is, the classroom is a good time to hit some of the deep issues, but on our own time, sometimes we're more interested in confirming what we think is true rather than confronting what we don't know is true. And so for me, I know that asking the right questions is a huge role of that. And so for our audiences at home, that's in the framing of this interview, I reached out to both of you to be an active participant in asking the questions so that the right questions get asked in order to get the right answers. So I really appreciate both of your insights. We're gonna jump into one of the questions. In the last few months, we've seen a lot of unrest, and we know that it was sparked by a pretty significant incident. But before we really talk about the meat of that, I'm just curious, in what ways have either of you maybe experienced acts of discrimination, or maybe heard from another person directly some incidents of discrimination that just maybe have been brushed aside here in other people might not have considered that discrimination, but you guys have experienced?
So I think one thing to approach is that discrimination doesn't necessarily mean you're doing something on purpose to hurt somebody or to, hate them or anything like that. Discrimination, you can consider it sometimes as like an accidental insult. But the thing about the insult is that it can sometimes tell you what someone believes without them saying it explicitly. So I can say in my own experience, I've also, and everyone else as well, everyone experiences discrimination in a different way. It's always based on, your appearance typically, or how you speak, or how you behave, so because there's so much diversity in those three things, discrimination is a very diverse act in that it happens to different people in different ways. As for my own account, I can receive discrimination from a number of different people based on color. I'm very light-skinned, so you get people who say, oh, well, you're not dark, so you're not really black. You get white people who say, well, you're light, but you're not really white. So, it plays into a lot of different things. Other things that people, such as myself, like having mixed heritage as well, is that you'll get people coming up to you and asking you, what are you? Or you can say, oh, I'm from Texas. They'll say, okay, but where are you really from? Or where are your parents from? And they'll start getting like really detailed to figure out, to try to make sense of how you look. And I can understand the curiosity, and most of the time, I don't think people notice what they're doing, but it's the curiosity itself of trying to maybe dissect your bloodline that feels a little inhuman in those situations.
And Danielle, as I want to get your degree correct. You have correct me if I'm wrong, a doctorate in, is it psychology or counseling?
Mm-hmm. Clinical psychology. Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
Why do people tend to package things like that? Wanting to know exactly, or is it to maybe package a person? If you could speak to that.
What I've found is people want to know how to respond to you, and sometimes it's just curiosity. And once again, we talked about at the beginning, not knowing how to ask the question. Like when someone says, "What are you?" I was like, "I'm human." Or "What are you?" But I think just not knowing how to ask their curious questions, like a little kid who has a question for you, they just say the first thing comes to their mind. And I think we haven't educated ourselves enough to know how to broach that question when you see someone that's different. And like Anthony said, I don't think sometimes people mean it. And I call it an unchecked bias. It's a bias that you may have that you don't realize you have. And for that matter, it's not checked. It's not something you've dealt with. And people just want to understand. And some people live in their own world. That's just the bottom line for a lot of the questions that are asked inappropriately, is that people live in their own world, and they live in a world where if I ask you a question, you should answer it. And they don't see it as a negative. It's like, well, at least I asked, instead of assuming. So in counseling, I work with a lot of people on learning who they are and how they see the world. So for going back to your question about personal situations that have happened, I've had a lot of situations that happen where people will say, "You're so well spoken, or you responded so well to that, and I'm just so proud of you." And it's like, why? You expect me to not be well spoken? So it's the underlying responses that people, I think, are trying to be supportive, but the way it comes across is, would you say that to anyone? Or are you saying it to me because I'm African American and you didn't expect me to be well spoken? So that's when I get quite a bit. Or you look so nice, or your hair is so well kept, or your son is so well behaved because he's standing quietly at the cart with me at the store. He'll get comments from people that he's so well behaved. I'm like, what do you want him to be doing? Run through the store like yelling? So it doesn't make sense because he hasn't done anything to really be behaved besides standing still. So those are the kind of underlying discriminative things that happen that I don't think people realize they're doing. I think they're trying to be helpful in some instances, but it comes across differently. So
thank you both for sharing.
And I'll add a little bit to that, because I've had some people ask me about the compliment of well-spoken and why it's taken in a negative way. And it's because it's not a common compliment that you hear about people. You can go to a conference and network with 300 people, and you can praise one and say, oh, this person has this skill, they've accomplished this, they've accomplished that, they've done this for their community, they live over here. But you don't usually hear someone say like, oh, and they're well-spoken. Like maybe they're a good public speaker, they're good at this, but well-spoken just sounds different. And it usually applies to darker skinned people or people of color. And it kind of lays down expectations. And the end of this is that, as I said before, like discrimination is not outright, and it's not always outright, I'll say, and it isn't always meant to hurt you. So in a lot of cases, you don't know if you're being discriminated against or not. Like when she said, when someone says her son is well behaved, are they saying that because their children are rowdy, or are they saying that because they expect her child to like behave a certain way? Is standing around quietly supposed to be good behavior, or are they saying that they've never seen a Black child stand around quietly while their parents talk? And so you never really know like 100% sure sometimes what's happening with these comments and what they mean.
That's interesting. It kind of jumps us into the topic of privilege. It seems like it's become a trigger word. So the question is, why do you think it's so hard for us as a society to talk about privilege? And in what ways? I'm just curious. Have you seen privilege be masked within education, and that might be in terms of opportunities or advancement?
I think the word privilege is hard for a lot of people to take in, like I said at the beginning, because it's uncomfortable. And some people don't realize that they have a privilege and what that entitles. And some people are like, I don't want the privilege. Like, well, you may not want it, but you have it. And in understanding what to do with that privilege. And sometimes it's some guilt from some people who I've talked to who feel guilty that they have that privilege. So what I've been doing is working with people on how to use the privilege they have and how to identify it. Like we were driving looking for a home the other day, and my husband got out of the car. I immediately got nervous if he's out looking at a house because other people in the neighborhood came out. Is that something that someone who was white would have had that fear if they got out of their car to look at a house? Would they be nervous that something's going to happen to their son or to their husband? So those kinds of things. I think having friends who understand they have a privilege. So if something happens when you're with your friends, like if they go for a bike ride, understanding they may say something to my son, but not to you, and being able to stand up for that. So I think when we say you have a privilege, sometimes people get nervous and uncomfortable and they don't know what to do with it. So I've been encouraging people to use their privilege to help their friends, to stand up, to fight for each other, and to say this is unfair and it's unkind. Just like with Rachel's challenge, the kindness factor steps in. You have to be kind no matter who that person is, and use your privilege like you would use your power at work to hire and fire. Use your privilege for good for those who you say you love and respect. And I think if you don't understand why you have a privilege or where that came from, like the history behind it, that also causes some confusion. So I think just having that conversation and dealing with that uncomfortableness. And so I would challenge the parents who are watching to be brave. Talk to your kids. Have real conversations about what privilege means and how they can use it or not use it.
You want to say something?
Me?
Okay. I think off of the topic of privilege, I think I want to go into, I guess, a good way to understand it, like a good method to understand it. And it would be, if you grew up with a sibling, I would say if you grew up with a sibling, you understand what privilege is. And the reason is because you see in your own home, in your daily life, how you can be treated different from someone else. Let's say when you were a kid, you can also run experiments. I did that when I was a kid, run experiments with my brother, and I would complain like, oh, you're being treated better than me, or he would say vice versa. And so one of us would run through the house screaming and see the response. And one of the parents say, oh, calm down, what's wrong? And cool. And we wait maybe like a few hours, whatever. Then I go and run through the house screaming, and my parents respond, why are you screaming? Why are you doing this? What's wrong with you? And so on. And so, you start to see those things as a kid based on how you're treated. And, when you're a kid, you take advantage of it because, it's to your benefit, obviously. But I think the mistake that people come to is that as they get older, they understand that privilege as something that they've earned. And so that they're being treated better, they're being treated differently because they earned this, and not necessarily because of nothing about who they are, just based on someone's impression of them, how they look, if their families know each other, whatever. You can get treated differently for a number of different things that has nothing to do with who you are. It could be you're wearing someone's favorite tie that day. And so I think coming at that same approach is how people should approach their privilege. And it's that you will be treated better by someone else because they see something in you that relates to them, or they have more sympathy for you because they know something about you, or they see something there that allows them to treat you differently from someone else. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that, it's good to acknowledge and good to be aware of it, and then practice going against that privilege in terms of recognizing it within yourself and what makes you treat other people better, and recognize when you're treating someone not as well just because they don't have that connection with you, and adjusting.
That's powerful. Thank you for sharing. When I was first confronted by the fact that, I had privilege just because of my appearances when I was living in Egypt as a white American, if something were to happen to me in the street, I recognize that many people would see, that it could create a larger incident, especially in the international part of the city that I lived in. My wife, I married, she was Egyptian. She's now a naturalized U.S. citizen. I remember her telling me, I'd be a little bit cavalier, and if there's a dispute in the street, I'd go and kind of separate. I want to be a peacekeeper, and so I would separate if I saw somebody being, their rights being impinged upon. I would step in, and I never forgot I'll never forget what she said. She said, Greg, nothing might ever happen to you, but you have to remember who you're married to. And I said, as a woman who full equality has not been brought there in Egypt, as a ethnic minority in terms of, religious minority living in Egypt, she said that you have to understand that, another person is going to be, possibly harmed by that. And it was that dichotomy that I really had to stop back and do some reflection upon who I am and who other people are, right? And the type of privileges that they just don't even have afforded to just because of either their appearance or their affiliation. And it was something that it shook me a bit. And so getting back into America, post-civil rights, why is it difficult for us to talk about racial equality? So a lot of people might say, hey, it's already been, equality's been given, but why is this so difficult for us to say, hey, we need to go further?
I think people don't believe it still exists. They think that everything is fine, everything is good, because if in their house and in their world, they're not being affected, then it's okay. I think all the recent things that are happening now because of technology and because of how the world is, students are able to see everything. Students, meaning adults and kids, are able to see everything that's happening. Plus with COVID, we're all at home. So we're able to see and read more because we have more time on our hands. And I think people are starting to see more of the things that we've been seeing forever. It hasn't gone away for anyone who's African-American that I know. Anthony, you may know someone, but it's always been there, that inequality is still there. And I think because some people choose to believe that everyone is doing what they should be doing, and because they're not directly affected, it doesn't touch them. But it's still touching a lot of people. If you have anyone in your family who is of a different race, you see it and hear it more often. Those fears are still there. So it's a law, but it's not being carried out. Kind of like Juneteenth. It took 2 more years for Texas to get the word. Same thing here, is just taking a long time. And I think we do a lot of protesting and then it falls off. Somebody gets hurt, like Rodney King, and it falls off. So I think people get comfortable and they think everything's okay, so they don't keep pushing. But I think now it's a little different.
I think an additional issue to that might be frequency and hearing about these issues. And, it's similar to like, if there's problems in the world that don't affect you, and yet, it pops up on the news, and then it pops up in a school email, and it pops up here and it pops up there, you're probably going to be more likely to resist that idea just because you see it so much. Like you see it pop up so much, but you don't experience it. And so, I don't know why this is going on. So I think part of resistance towards talking about this topic is because it can come up so often, or can come up at critical points where no one really wants to address it. They're like, I've seen it enough. I look at a history book, it doesn't exist anymore, so let's just leave it like that. And it's still a reality for a lot of people. And in addition to what you were just saying a moment ago, the segments of people that believe in this, or that address it, or that see it, or that don't see it, are so wide ranging that it's really hard to just pinpoint who is willing to talk about it. Because even in the Black community, you'll find people who don't want to talk about it, who say, oh, well, just ignore it and it'll go away. Other people who say, well, it needs to be addressed. Other people who say, well, we need to have our own because this will never get fixed. Like it's such a abstract problem that no one solution will clearly work at the moment. But the point is to be able to talk about and open up and address things that have happened in history.
So let's jump into a little bit kind of parallel topic. There are those that would say that they eschew explicit racism. They say that that's wrong, and they would categorize themselves as, I'm not racist. They'll just, and they may even be able to enumerate George Floyd's death was a horrific injustice, and just be very adamant. But then they might also say, I don't see it as a larger issue of race. And they may say things like, I just don't see race. What would be a way that you or any other person might go about in addressing that part of the question? I mean, possibly affirming, hey, thank you for not being racist. However, how might you guys go about that?
For myself, and it's going to sound a little rude, but I think that's a foolish statement to say that you don't see race, is because it's a phenotype. Like, it is literally on the face of the person that you see. You know, you can't help but see someone looks different from you, or someone looks like someone can just have a different eyebrow shape than you. You can still see the difference. And the point is that being violent or being hateful towards, let's say in this example, Black people, is not, just because you don't do those things, it doesn't mean you're not a racist. It just means you're not violent. You don't outwardly hate someone and look out to hurt them. But you have to look at the underlying issue, where it has to do with maybe your reasoning or your perspective, where someone can say, oh, well, this one killing happened, but it's just that one. And what you end up hearing is that it doesn't seem to bother them that someone got killed by a service worker who's supposed to protect you. It doesn't seem to bother them that someone got killed for a reason that was non-violent. I think I've heard some people say, well, George Floyd was a criminal, or George Floyd was having counterfeit money, and different excuses like that. But what you really hear is that, so anyone who commits a small petty crime deserves to die. Anyone who ends up maybe by accident with a fake dollar bill deserves to die. And so that's what I'm saying. It has to do with the underlying perspective of what you're understanding and what you believe. And I think the way that the world is today, people are very terrified of that label of being racist. And instead of addressing the issue, people have taken on the form of hiding it. And like you said, enumerating excuses, enumerating friends, enumerating what they've seen in situations, and publicly announcing what they believe just to gain favor, but not really addressing inside of them, like, how are you responding to this situation? What are you seeing when this happens? What do you feel when this happens?
Is the recording still going? It gave me a message.
I believe it's still recording. It said we can time, so I love it.
Okay. That was a loaded question. So I think what you were asking was about the movements. That was one of the questions you had, like, why, if they're not, all the things aren't violent, why are we still having all these different movements that are happening? Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think if we look at people, some people ask me, why are they doing all these movements? Why are we having all these protests? Why are they going for 14 days every day? And if you look, I'll send you the website later. There are 14 or 15 things that have happened and laws that got passed because they did protest every day, and they did go every day. And I think what I was telling my son was a difference about these movements and about these acts that are happening after George Floyd is it's a violent act that has happened numerous times to African-American males and females. But this time, because of everyone being at home, there's more attention to it, and it's worldwide. People worldwide are tired. They're learning, they're hearing, they're upset, they're frustrated, and now they're wanting to help. And they're fighting for us. So it's not just African Americans fighting or just Native Americans fighting. It's everyone is out fighting. And a lot of laws have been put into place. People are taking recognition of all the things that have happened. And I think that's a little different than the Civil War or past times when things have happened, because it happened in New York protests. But now it's happening and everyone is protesting, trying to bring more attention to it so that it can stop, trying to say, hey, it's not equal. Things are not okay. And I think a lot of people have a hard time knowing what to do or how to help. And it's hard to admit that in this day and age, we still have people who see someone as African American riding a bike and see them as harmful, or see them going in a store and seeing them as harmful. That still exists. It's not gone away. And like Anthony said, if it's not happening in your house or in your world, we don't want to talk about it. We'd rather just say, I'm not going to do that. And teaching people how to address what is happening and what they can do is important, and it's uncomfortable. And I think, like you said, being labeled a racist is a hard term for someone to take. And they're like, I'm not racist. I have 3 Black friends. You know, I've had that said to me many times about they're not. And a lot of times they don't know what to ask or how to ask. And I go back to, some things are just taught. You may not be teaching your kid to be racist, but you're not teaching them not to be racist either. Like, what are you addressing in your home? What is your kid seeing? Are you having that conversation? And if you're not, they're going to get it from the media, which is not always a great place to get it. So, and go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the remarkable things about this movement, which seems different than the previous Black Lives Matter movements, is how multiracial, you know, the crowds and the supporters have looked. And it seems like Generation Z and the millennials, you know, they have a very different mindset as to how they're seeing this issue. I was just curious, you know, especially as we talk about the role of the media, why is it that we see, or is it true that we have this like different component at work and at play here that has not existed prior?
Wait. So your question was, what is the different component, or do we believe there's a different component that's playing now versus in the past?
Yeah. So as I look at the crowds, it seems like you saw Senator Mitt Romney march in Utah. Now, I'm not sure, you know, all of his reasons. He did post on his Twitter account a picture of his father marching in the 60s, and so that was one of the compelling factors for him. But I've seen what appears to be a little bit more of a conscientious effort of the youth, the people in my generation, and the students that I teach in Generation Z, that seem to be a little bit more active. And yeah. I'm just curious, how engaged are they really, and what might have been some of the things that have led to their engagement in this time around?
I think I view it as the access to the internet, access to cell phones, the access to like very rapid communication that in the past didn't really exist, where you couldn't call and sympathize with someone who had the same problem as you in New York. You couldn't go and find a crowd in Seattle who had the same belief about you about this particular issue. You couldn't reach out to another crowd in Detroit who overturned a law and get advice for them on how to do it in your own city. But now the way information is so quickly shared, there's 2 sides to the coin. People have access to unlimited amounts of information. You can join Facebook groups, you can join messenger groups, whatever, on how to get involved in the government, how to turn over laws, how to protest peacefully, how to do this, how to do that, how to change your overall situation in your community. But the other side of that coin is it also opens up the door to misinformation, and allow people to give opinions or like radical ideas that may or may not be true. So I think that's part of just the information age that we're in now, that everybody can get a general understanding of what other people are going through without having been there, without having been through it.
Mm-hmm. I did an interview recently with the Children's Hour, and one of the kids asked me about something she saw. And she said, Donald Trump is going to send all the Black people away. And she's like 8 years old or 6 years old or something. And the poor baby really believed that that could happen. So internet, she's hearing a lot of stuff from the internet. And we talking with her about the internet and what that meant, that wasn't necessarily true. But then she had other questions because she has a lot of friends who are African American. She has friends who are Hispanic. She has friends who are Native American. And she doesn't want anything bad to happen to them, because until someone pointed out to her, they were just her friends. They weren't Black or Native American or Hispanic. They were just her friends. And I think that's a big piece too, is that now, even looking at my son, his whole friend base here in New Mexico is Caucasian or Hispanic. So all his friends are calling and wondering, we want to help, we want to fight with you, we want to be there for you. So I think this generation is way more mixed families, more mixed marriages, more the commercials you see now, more families with the Black mom and white dad, or vice versa. You see a lot more of integration in this generation. And for most of the kids who were born 8 to 10 years ago, they had a Black president. So that's what they are used to, seeing someone of African American color in charge of the world or the country. So their view of things, I think, is different because they're not understanding, well, why is this not okay? What's happening? And so I think because of those relationships that are happening, they're all fighting. And like you said, the internet is out there and everyone's reading and checking and seeing, and they can identify people they know of that race who may be affected. And I think that's another piece to account for, is that they can personally attach a person to George Floyd. They may say, I know an African-American male who's like a dad to me, and I would hate for that to happen to him. So I think our world is changing as a whole, which is good. There's a lot more integration, a lot more awareness, but we also are at home. So I think, like Anthony said, their internet is going all day from COVID to the racial acts. I think it happened right when everyone's at home. So people are at home and they have time to protest. They have time to read and delve into what's happening instead of just hearing it and being at work and being at soccer practice and moving. We're all kind of still. So it's like you're a captive audience. So people are hearing and learning a lot more than they probably would have if our world was in its normal state.
So piggybacking off of that question, we have access to all this information and trying to discern what is real and what is fake. What do you see the role of education in all of this? How do you see education helping to not specifically tell students what they should do, but provide opportunities for students to be active in this way?
I think having the discussions. I think we have no problem discussing all the isms, sexism, all the other isms except for racism. Whenever that comes up, it's not as easily talked about. And I think it's a very hard topic to broach, but I think it needs to be addressed. It needs to be in an educational setting because it's happening. Things are happening that you may not think are, and they're subtly happening in the school. And I think the educators have a captive audience, just like you're teaching them about Cameron's had amazing history teachers, so he's learned so much information. And just being able to pick, for example, when they have projects, having African Americans to study, to learn about that history, being able to, we just did a project recently, and his group picked someone African American on purpose. He asked them to, and they researched, so the whole group learned about Frederick Douglass from beginning to end, good and bad. And during COVID, so Cameron's school doesn't play, they do school all year. And we love it. But his peers were happy that they were able to learn about Frederick Douglass because they had picked someone else. And when he asked, they studied him. So I think giving opportunities to study the history behind racism, the history behind slavery, not just for a moment, but making it part of your everyday curriculum, making it a part of everyday conversation and addressing it, and not making it be such a stigma to talk about. I think a lot of people are afraid to even mention the word racism or to talk about slavery because my son mentioned that every time they say the word slavery or racism, everyone in the class looks at him. And he's like, are you looking at me? So, but I think using your education, like Cameron School does. I think you all do a great job of that. I think incorporating it more would be important. And that would be my only suggestion. Anthony?
I'm glad we brought this back to, like, I guess the education level, the kids level, because I know we were getting like really out there.
Yeah.
So I will say, at the education level, kids. So the same way with your son Cameron, you know, when history is talked about in class and all the kids look at him, it's kind of like, why are you looking at me? And it you know, that reaction shows you that for him, he's just another kid. Like, black kid is not a white kid, not everyone else is a white kid at that moment. He's just a kid. And so the history and the stigma that has to do with racism, enslavement of Africans, all of that is not really like personalized into him and identified into him just yet, because he's still growing. So I would say for a lot of kids, when they're going through that, I think that is the time to teach them about it, to teach them about all the details of the good and the bad of all situations, when it comes to previous presidents, when it comes to the enslavement of Africans, when it comes to, you know, throughout World War II and Japanese internment camps and so forth. This is the time to get those details, because those kids are impressionable at the time. They're willing to hear it, internalize it, and then they'll always have that history like in the back of their mind, whether they relate to it or not. And so when they get older, it's not like something they've never heard of. It's not like they assume the history is only good, the history of America is only good, or the history of Africans is only good, or whatever. They know the good and bad sides. And I will add another point, that education takes place both in the classroom and at home and everywhere else that these kids go. When you're at home and something, let's say you're watching a movie and then this guy a black man gets shoved into a police car, roughly, you know, if nothing is said about that, or you don't hear a comment about that, the kid watches it, it's just like, well, no one said anything, it's normal. Or let's say you're talking on the phone with a friend, let's say, oh, I can't believe people back in the day used to say jokes like this, and it's a racist joke. Your kid heard that whole conversation, but he'll probably only remember the one racist joke and repeat it at school or repeat it to friends, and it'll evolve from there. So I think part of the responsibility of education lies within the family, and to correct those mistakes, not just stop them. Because there are people who will say, oh, you know, maybe a child will say the N-word, he heard it in a song or he heard it in a movie, and the parents will just yell, don't say that, don't say that, don't ever say that. The kid gets punished, and he doesn't say it again at home, but he doesn't understand why he shouldn't say it. And
so the education, yeah.
And unfortunately, kids look to each other for education. So the same way with your son, maybe a bunch of kids will ask him like, oh, why can't I say this word? Or why can't I say this? And maybe he won't have an answer. Maybe he'll panic in the moment and give a made up answer that he believes may be true. And then all of the kids will run with it. They'll say that is true for all Black people. And that's not necessarily the case. It's all personalized. Some people can be okay with something and another person cannot. But kids, especially kids, try to simplify issues and find the single solution to something. And so I think it would also be drilling in the fact that it's not the same for everybody.
So do you think is there still implicit racism within education?
Yes. And when you say within the classroom, yes, in terms of the way history books are written, in terms of the details that are given, in terms of, like, let's say no one mentions George Washington owned slaves. No one mentioned that Abraham Lincoln emancipated soldiers, but he also had segregated armies. You know, they don't teach both sides of the same coin. They just try to simplify one thing another way or paint it nicely another way. And something I personally always catch my ear on is that people say slaves instead of enslaved Africans or enslaved people. And for me, the difference is that slave is an identity and being enslaved is something that happens to you. And so the way that gets taught is like, you're saying someone was a slave from the get-go. They've always been a slave. That's who they are. Versus they were someone who was enslaved. They were someone who was taken captive and forced to do labor. It just gives, for me, it gives a whole nother context.
One of the things that I see as a history teacher, and it's not necessarily what is placed in the books, it's what is omitted from the story. Anthony, thank you for sharing that. That's as somebody who, Danielle, you probably know, I love presenting even controversial things that where students have to wrestle with, because that is important, to wrestle with the topic and be made uncomfortable. I think that's where growth happens. You go to a gym, you don't develop muscles unless you're under some stress. Your muscles are under some stress. And I think the mind needs to grow that way as well. But that means we have to encounter the things that are not just placed in there, but were things that were intentionally omitted because it made us uncomfortable. And as you said, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson is another person who has memorials, right? And people are uncomfortable because he wrote part of it, all men are created equal in the Declaration. And yet we know that other side, and we know like his descendants today are saying, you know what, the memorial should come down. Monticello, I can't remember how you pronounce the name, is enough because it tells the full history. And that's the difficult part, is telling the full history, because then you have to look at it from so many different angles. And I think that's hard. It's hard for us to look and consider things from so many different vantage points. I'm sorry.
Just very quickly, I will say that you as a history teacher, you're in a unique position as any teacher to change at least one child's life in that classroom. I was lucky enough in high school. For me, I had the greatest history teacher in the world when I was in high school. And I was, he had his own problems, but he changed everything for me when it came to history. And that doesn't mean to say that I liked him all the time, because I didn't. But now I fully appreciate like everything that he put us through in terms of, he went above and beyond. There were days of class where he would skip study sessions and just play a movie, and play like a very historically accurate movie, and give us challenges before the movie even started and say, hey, if anyone can identify the scene where the tree looks like a cross, you get a bonus point. The first person to identify who this person is within the historical context, and let's say their name isn't explicitly given in the movie, you get a bonus point. And so he kind of like rewarded us by forcing us to pay close attention. And there were those scenes, they weren't just for nothing, like they had significance. There was a reason why in the scene the tree was shaped like a cross, and he would explain to that after. He would give us horribly long projects that broke people's wallets, in terms of like completely immersing yourself in the history of something. We did the French Revolution. We had to dress in rags. We had to do research online into census papers from France in the 1600s to find out how their currency compared to us today, how much bread we could afford at that time for what kind of job we had in our family, in our make-believe family, how many of our children died, so on. We had to do Japanese projects, Japanese cultural projects. My group was assigned Samurai. Another group was assigned Daughter's Day. They spent hours creating tiny little model dolls for Daughter's Day and created the entire step system and reenacted the entire ceremony. We did the same for Samurai. We explained the whole ritual suicide, and we got bonus points for being even more detailed. Like, I think his bar was set like, if you do adequate, you'll get like a C+. So we had to go above, we had like blood bags in our clothes. So when someone strikes you, it explodes blood. And, we did all these things. And at first they were stressful, but in those moments, they were incredibly bonding moments with other students in the class. And to today, I remember nearly everything I've ever learned in that history class. And that was about 7 to 8 years ago.
So he made it real, he made it relevant.
Yes.
And
we had to analyze even song lyrics.
I wanted to jump in and just say, I know we're talking about education and we're putting a lot on teachers. And I think a lot of parents put a lot on teachers to teach some things that start at home. Children aren't born racist. They, at the playground, they see another kid, they're playing. They don't care. They're kids. They learn from what we say and what we don't say. They learn from the books we give them at home. Like, do all the books in your house pertain only white kids? Do the books in your home only pertain Black kids? Learning how to make everyone normal. Everyone rides a bike. Everyone throws a ball. Everyone has picnics. So incorporating that at home, I think also is important to that implicit, explicit racism that happens, I think gets woven in and we don't realize it. Like back to the children's hour again, some of the kids were like, I've been noticing all the TV commercials have people that are white on them and all the presidents have been white so they're learning those things as well. But I think the parents have to have those conversations before you all get them at school in 7th and 8th grade. Because, by 3, they've already gotten pretty much their idea of who people are and how they're going to respond to some things and psychologically who they see and who's safe, who's not safe. Based on what we give them. So I think the parents, once again, who are listening, be brave. And what are you incorporating in your home that's helping your student to see everyone as equal, to see everyone as just like them? Are you pointing that out? So I think that's very important to put some of that back on us parents to incorporate that into our households.
Part of my my religious community, one of the interesting things is not this past week, but the week before, we were challenged to read books that we would normally not read about reconciliation and religion, and from the framework of different authors that we haven't considered, from the vantage point of how. So there's a Black author, Black American author, and talking about this. And so I think that we tend to read what's around us and we tend to not go beyond that. And so you see a lot of books that have been written from a certain framework, which is often there's a racial component to that framework. But unless you've read something from a different framework, you aren't going to be able to fully understand some of those issues. And so I remember being challenged by that. And as you spoke, I think that I'm going to have to look at my bookshelves and do an inventory. Now, everything behind me, education books, but it really is, that's a deep challenge. And so the movies, the television, the channels of films that I'm watching from Netflix, am I watching things that make me comfortable, or do I go beyond my comfort zone? And I think I need to do a self-inventory as well. So thank you, Danielle. That was stirring in me. I didn't mean for that to be as passionate of a reaction, but I loved that. And so you were talking about at home, and so we've talked about it a little bit. But what do you think are the roles of educators in refining some of these themes?
For myself, like the example I gave, if you know more, or if you encourage yourself, or you're encouraged to know more about what you're teaching, give that same thing to the kids. Like if the school, I don't know about the education rules here in terms of if you're allowed to go outside of what the curriculum says, or you're allowed to go outside of the history book itself and give more information. Or in any class really, but if you are, go ahead and do that. You go beyond, give the kids more than what they ask for. Like I said, with my history teacher, he encouraged our talents. if you had a low grade at the end of the semester, they'll say, okay, find a significant historical character that we talked about in class and draw a portrait of him if the person was an artist. Someone else who didn't know art, they knew music, okay, write a song about this person's life, you know, and it kind of just pushes the kids to go a little beyond what's expected of them.
Providing those extra opportunities, I think that's really powerful. You know, one of the other things I've been doing this summer has been scoring and reviewing federal grants. And there's quite a number of different districts that are actively trying to recruit, and it's called males of color, MOC. That's the official terminology, because there's I would say a lot of different districts are lacking, even though the population demographics, they're just underrepresented. And so I don't know if either of you can speak to that, but why, if you are able to speak to that, why do you think that there is a shortage or a downfall in males of color being teachers in education?
Well, I know several males of color who are teachers, and I think how they're perceived. I know of a couple here in town who work in elementary schools, and I think they have to work really hard to be perceived as caring and giving and calm and not a threat for some of the parents, just because of how they present. No matter how they say it, if someone has a perception of how African American males are, they respond to him that way. So I think the areas that they work in, they may work in more rural areas or areas where there are more African American people, just so they can be comfortable in their